It was supposed to be just another ordinary argument. The kind that starts with a sideways glance and ends in bitter silence in the car until someone gives in. But that afternoon, everything took a different turn. The sky was overcast, and the dry wind tapped against the windows as we drove down a narrow road, far from the city. I stared out the window, eyes damp, my chest tight like I couldn't breathe. He, behind the wheel, kept his lips shut and his fingers clenched around the steering wheel, like he was holding himself back from exploding. My name is Emily. I'm 27 years old, and that day I had no idea I was about to live through the cruelest and most liberating moment of my life. It all started with a stupid comment during an outing I hadn't even wanted to go on. He insisted on hanging out with his friends that weekend, saying, "It'll be good for us." But in reality, I knew I was just a decorative presence among laughs, drinks, and conversations that left me out. The reason for the fight? Jealousy, according to him. Lack of a sense of humor, his friends said. But to me, it was just another moment of disrespect dressed up as a joke. I asked to leave. They laughed. On the way back, the silence broke when he said mockingly, "You really need to learn how to relax. No one did anything to you." I answered with tears in my eyes, tired of feeling invisible. I just wanted to go home, to feel the solid ground of somewhere safe. But instead, he pulled the car over on a dirt road without saying a word. He got out, walked around to my side, opened my door, and said, "Get out. Go think about your life. Let's see how you make it back." And then he laughed. He wasn't alone. His friends in the back seat burst out laughing like it was some inside joke. For a few seconds, I thought it was just another bluff, that he'd come back, maybe even regretful. But no. The car sped off, kicking up dust on my feet and leaving me there, in the middle of nowhere with no cell signal. No one around, just a light purse and a shattered heart. I stood there, frozen, watching the car disappear around the bend. Their laughter still echoed in my head. A sound that, for a long time, would mix with the hum of abandonment and humiliation. The sun was already beginning to set. I started walking, not knowing where to go. The road stretched on, empty, lined with tall grass and no visible signs. Every step felt like it was pulling me farther from anything I could call home. The ache in my legs grew with the lump in my throat. I didn't know whether to cry, scream, or just collapse right there. That night, I slept curled up behind a tree, trying to shield myself from the wind. I ate the last of a pack of crackers I had in my purse and hugged my arms tight, as if trying to convince myself this would all be over soon. But deep down, I knew something inside me had broken for good. It was there, alone on that forgotten road, that I finally began to see what my mind had refused to accept for so long. I was in an abusive relationship. And that abandonment, as cruel as it was revealing truths I had never wanted to face. Still, I had no idea what was coming next. 5 days passed. 5 days that would completely change the course of my story. And when he finally found me, I was no longer the woman he had left behind. As I walked along the road, feet swollen, face dirty, body exhausted, my mind kept revisiting everything that had brought me to that moment. The dust on my shoes seemed to carry with it the grime of years in which I slowly faded, accepting less than I deserved, allowing myself to be shaped into whatever was most convenient for others, never for me. I grew up in a home where love was synonymous with silence. My parents, always busy, prioritized their careers and appearances. There was food on the table, yes, but never presence, never warmth. I learned early on that crying was weakness. Complaining was ungratefulness, and hoping for affection was a sign of neediness. So I grew up with a hole in my chest, trying to fill it by pleasing others. Becoming an easy person to live with felt like the only way I could ever deserve love. When I met Nathan, I was 23, and desperate to be seen. He was outgoing, handsome, the kind of man who could walk into a room and instantly become its center. In the beginning, he smothered me with attention, constant messages, sweet nicknames, impulsive declarations. I mistook intensity for love, and gave myself completely. It didn't take long for that intensity to turn into control. The first criticisms came disguised as advice. This outfit doesn't suit you. You should smile more. Then came the jealousy. Why did that coworker talk to you like that? And later, the comparisons. My ex-girlfriends weren't so dramatic. I adapted. I gave in. I swallowed the pain for the sake of a relationship I was convinced was real. And he knew that. Nathan didn't need to yell to hurt me. All it took was a look of disdain, a mocking laugh in front of his friends when I said something, the cold silence after an argument. I constantly felt small, yet I clung to the rare moments when he was kind again, like someone begging for crumbs at a feast they were never invited to. Little by little, I drifted away from my own desires. I stopped going out with my friends, gave up on personal projects, even dropped out of my postgraduate program because it took too much of my time and pulled us apart. I became a shadow. Still breathing, still smiling in photos, but inside, I was quietly falling apart. He said he loved me, but his love had rules. It had conditions, and I had to fit into them, or be discarded. The peak of my submission was that very weekend. I hadn't wanted to go. I knew I'd be excluded, that I wouldn't feel part of anything. But I went anyway, afraid of seeming rude, afraid of sparking another fight. And the outcome was even worse than I could have imagined. That second night, sitting alone on the cold road, stomach empty, eyes swollen from crying, a question hit me like lightning. When did I stop loving myself? A simple question, but one that carried a world of pain. And more than that, truth. For the first time in years, I couldn't justify his behavior. For the first time, I looked at myself with compassion, not guilt. The woman curled up by the roadside was the same one who once dreamed big, who wanted to travel the world, write books, build a career. What happened? To her? The answer was brutal, but clear. She had been erased. Bit by bit, until only the parts that served someone else's comfort remained. But the road was still there. The silence of the night was deep, but somehow it allowed me to hear a voice I'd silenced long ago. My own. The next morning, when I saw a truck approaching, I didn't hesitate. I raised my arm and asked for help. I must have looked alarming, but the driver, an older man with a kind expression, stopped without asking questions. He simply said, "Do you need help?" And in that moment, eyes full of tears, I replied, "Yes, but not just to get out of here." He offered me a ride to a nearby town. He had no idea, neither did I, that his simple gesture would begin a new chapter in my life. I had no plan, no destination, but I had something I hadn't felt in a long time, the chance to start over. And as the truck rolled forward, taking me away from that road and everything it symbolized, I still didn't know that, just a few days later, Nathan would cross my path again. Only this time, I'd be ready to face him. The road felt endless, but in that moment, inside the simple cabin of that truck, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time. Safety. The man who'd offered me a ride was named Robert, early 60s, light eyes, hands marked by time and labor. He didn't ask intrusive questions or show any trace of judgment. He simply drove in silence, respecting my space, as if he instinctively knew that one wrong word might cause me to break. "There's a good diner up ahead," he said, his voice steady but kind. "We can stop there if you'd like something to eat." I nodded slightly. I was starving. But more than that, I was exhausted from the life I'd been living. And for the first time, I allowed myself to accept help without shame. At the diner, he paid for my breakfast without expecting thanks. We sat across from each other at a plain wooden table, the smell of fresh bread and coffee gently pulling me back into reality. Then he said something I'll never forget. "I don't know what you've been through, but I've seen a lot of lost souls on this road. Some go back home, others build a new one." Those words echoed through me like thunder. It was as if, right there, between a coffee cup and respectful silence, he gave me the permission I'd never granted myself. The permission to start over. After breakfast, we drove to a small town called Everidge. I'd never heard of it, but everything about it felt calm, almost suspended in time. Low houses, people walking slowly down the streets, storefronts with handwritten signs. When Robert pulled over, he pointed to a modest inn on the corner. "Talk to Miss Irene. Tell her Robert sent you. She helps folks who need a break, and you look like you could use one." I thanked him, still struggling to believe what was happening. It was as if life, after turning its back on me, was finally offering a hand. The woman who owned the inn was elderly, her white hair pulled into a bun, her eyes sharp and knowing, like she could see past the surface. When I explained, in few words and much embarrassment, that I didn't have any money, she simply said, "You help me in the kitchen for a few days, and we'll call it even. Everyone needs a beginning, dear." And that's how my new life began. I washed dishes, made beds, helped serve meals, and in my free time, I started walking around town, rediscovering what it meant to observe the world without fear, without needing to please anyone. People greeted me, even if they didn't know me. The town, small as it was, welcomed me like a mother receiving back her lost child. On one of those walks, I found the public library. It was tiny, with wooden shelves full of worn-out books. The librarian, a soft-voiced woman named Sarah, invited me in. And in that quiet space, surrounded by stories of rebirth, struggle, romance, and discovery, something inside me began to stir. I started visiting the library every day, after work. I read about self-esteem, abusive relationships, about women who rebuilt themselves after trauma. It felt like every page gave me back a piece of myself that had been taken away over the years. For the first time, I saw myself in the stories I read, and more importantly, I began to write my own. One afternoon, Sarah asked if I'd like to help with the teen book club. She said she needed someone who knew how to listen, who had empathy. I hesitated. I still saw myself as broken, but she insisted. So I said yes. At every meeting, I saw in their eyes the same longing that had once lived in mine. To be heard, to be understood, to be seen. Slowly, I began to share pieces of my journey, and without realizing it, I went from someone who needed help to someone who could offer it. That's how those 5 days passed. 5 days of simple work, quiet encounters, and a slow but powerful rebuilding. I still carried open wounds, it's true. I still longed for words I'd never hear, for an apology that would never come. But something fundamental had shifted. For the first time, I was choosing myself, and it was precisely when I began to feel whole, even in pieces, that he appeared. On the morning of the 5th day, as I walked out to buy bread from the corner bakery, I saw a car parked across the street. His car. I recognized it instantly, even before I saw him step out. My heart pounded, my legs nearly gave out. Nathan. He'd found me. But as he crossed the street with that same self-assured look, as if he still held some kind of power over me, he didn't find the same woman he'd left behind on the side of the road. No. He had no idea about the strength I had discovered within myself. And in that moment, I knew. Whatever happened next would change everything. There was a tension in the air that felt almost tangible, the kind that comes before a storm, not in the sky, but in the soul. When I saw Nathan across the street standing next to his car with his arms crossed, my stomach twisted. For a brief moment, I was back on that road again, hearing the tires roll away and the sound of laughter cutting through me like knives. But the moment passed. I was no longer the woman he once knew, no longer the Emily who settled for scraps and silence. And even with my heart racing, I stood tall, spine straight, gaze steady. He crossed the street in long, urgent strides, like someone trying to seize control before it slipped through his fingers. "Emily, thank God. Are you okay?" he said, breathless, like his concern was genuine. There was a time when I would have believed him. All it would have taken was that tone, the lowered eyes, the hand reaching for my arm. But now, all of it felt rehearsed and tired. I looked at him without flinching. "What are you doing here, Nathan?" He looked startled by my tone. He had expected something else: panic, tears, maybe even a relieved hug. But instead, he found composure, silence, dignity. I regretted it. I thought it was just a joke. "I came back right after, but you were gone. I freaked out. I've been looking for you for days." Joke. The word hit me with a mix of anger and pity. He still didn't understand the weight of what he'd done. To him, it was just a misstep, a moment of bad judgment. "You left me alone on an empty road, Nathan. You and your friends laughed at me like I was nothing. I could have been robbed, attacked, or just disappeared. That's not a joke. That's violence." He tried to defend himself, stammering out empty justifications. I was mad. I wasn't thinking. The guys were egging me on. I thought you'd just walk it off, cool down, and learn how to behave. I cut in, not raising my voice but unshakable. "That's what you wanted, right? To teach me a lesson. To show me that if I didn't shut up, you'd know how to punish me." He took a step back, as if hit by an invisible blow. I looked at him, and for the first time, I truly saw him. A small man, insecure, held together by pride and pretense. "I came after you because I care. You vanished. How do you think that made me feel?" The question felt absurd. For years, my emotions had been ignored. Now he wanted empathy, as if it were owed to him. I took a deep breath. There was no hatred in me, just a heavy, holy clarity. "Nathan, I'm no longer available to be your emotional compass. I'm not a place you return to when guilt creeps in. You're not here for me. You're here because you lost control, and you don't know how to live without it." He looked offended, confused. He tried changing the subject, talked about going home, giving us another chance, forgetting everything that had happened. But every word he spoke only pushed me further away. The woman he left on that roadside was afraid of being alone, afraid of not being loved. She searched for validation in other people's eyes. But I wasn't her anymore. I had found myself in the kindness of a stranger, in the quiet strength of a wise old woman, in the curious, open-hearted teens who listened to me, and in the pages of books that helped me rediscover my voice. Nathan kept talking, trying to salvage what no longer existed. But I knew the truth. There was nothing left to salvage. All that remained was my freedom, newfound and far too precious to give away again. "I'm not going back with you," I said at last, calm and clear. "My life isn't where you left me." The silence that followed was thick. He hadn't expected that. Not from this woman, not from me. "So, that's it?" he muttered, drained. "No, this isn't the end. It's the beginning." He left a few minutes later, head low, without saying another word. I don't know if he understood what had just happened, but I did. And that was what mattered. I walked back to the inn slowly, tears in my eyes but my heart light. The young woman who'd walked that road 5 days earlier had been lost. The woman now returning home was whole. But the journey wasn't over yet. There was still something I needed to do. Something that would take me beyond survival. It would allow me to bloom. And that decision would change the course of my story completely. The days following my encounter with Nathan were quiet on the outside, but intense within. The little town that had taken me in carried on at its gentle pace, the church bell marking the hours, birds singing at dawn, neighbors exchanging warm smiles as if words were optional. But inside me, something stirred. It was as if the universe kept asking again and again, "And now, Emily, what will you do with this freedom?" I had already said no to Nathan, a no that wasn't just for him, but for everything he stood for: submission, fear, the never-ending need for validation. But saying no is only the beginning. The real challenge is building a solid yes for yourself. and that's exactly what I chose to do. With help from Sarah, the librarian, and Miss Irene, who began treating me like the daughter life had gifted her, I started putting my dreams back together. I resumed studying online, rekindling an old desire to pursue a degree in psychology. I wanted to understand human pain more deeply, especially my own, and maybe one day help other women find themselves again, just as I'd begun to do with the teens in the reading group. With the money I'd saved from working at the inn, I rented a small room behind the house of a kind widow named Martha. She welcomed me with an open heart. It was modest, peeling walls, worn-out furniture, but for the first time in years, the space was entirely mine. In it, I could breathe freely, decide where to keep my books, what to cook for dinner, when to go to bed. They might seem like small things, but to me, they were victories. Nathan tried to keep in touch. He texted, he called, he even pretended to be sick, as a last-ditch attempt to pull me back into the role he'd known. But there was no going back. I no longer needed to explain myself or fight back. My silence became the most powerful answer I could give. Eventually, the messages stopped. And with them, the fear he had planted in me slowly faded too. A few weeks later, Sarah invited me to speak at a community gathering at the library. The theme, women's autonomy and self-esteem. As I looked out at the chairs filled with women, some young, some with silver strands in their hair, I felt something I had never known before. Belonging. In that small room, I finally realized that my pain hadn't been in vain. It had shaped me. Broken me, yes, but it had also rebuilt me. At the end of the talk, a young woman approached me, her eyes brimming with tears, and said, "I saw myself in every word you spoke. Thank you for showing me that it's possible to walk out of a dark place without losing the light inside." I hugged her tightly. It felt like I was holding my past self in my arms, offering her the comfort she'd needed for so long. That night, I wrote in my journal, "The road where I was left behind became the place where I was reborn, and the abandonment that once broke me also set me free." Today, when I look back, I don't carry hatred. I carry lessons. I'm not proud of what I endured, but I am proud of having walked away, because I said no, and that no gave me myself back. This is Emily's story, but it could be the story of so many women who, out of love or fear, forget who they are, who silence their wants, their pain, their boundaries, who accept far too little, hoping it will someday be enough.